Every year, millions of employees sit across a desk from their manager for an annual performance review. The tension in these rooms is palpable. The employee hopes to prove their worth, while the manager attempts to summarize 12 months of human effort into a single conversation. These traditional appraisals usually focus entirely on past performance and future objectives. They measure exactly what an employee achieved, hitting a quarterly sales quota, shipping a software feature, or keeping a department under budget. But measuring only the final output leaves a massive gap in the data. Traditional reviews ignore how the work was actually accomplished. A manager checking a spreadsheet knows if a project was finished on time, but they rarely see the day-to-day teamwork, the communication bottlenecks, or the specific leadership behaviors that drove the result. To capture that missing behavioral data, organizations use 360-degree feedback. Instead of a top-down evaluation of metrics, this system gathers observations from multiple people to evaluate specific, observable actions in the workplace. This split-screen diagram shows the exact difference. The traditional appraisal tracks past performance against goals. The 360-degree feedback system tracks behaviors for skill development. Because these systems measure different things, they serve distinct purposes. 360-degree feedback must be strictly reserved for personal growth, rather than determining salaries or bonuses. When a company stops relying entirely on historical metrics and begins tracking multi-directional behavioral data, they finally gain the necessary insight to develop effective leaders. Setting up this feedback loop requires a precise questionnaire. The parameters must evaluate execution, asking respondents to rate specific statements about how the subject communicates, resolves conflict, or delegates tasks. This organizational chart shows how the respondent data is sourced. A true 360-degree view requires input from every radius around the subject. That means collecting surveys from the employee's direct manager above, their adjacent peers, and the direct reports working below them. To guarantee that these respondents provide unvarnished, accurate observations, the entire data gathering process requires strict confidentiality. Direct reports will not provide honest critique about a manager's communication style if they fear retaliation. This is exactly why the feedback must remain entirely separate from financial compensation. If a team knows that their survey answers will directly impact a colleague's end-of-year bonus, they will artificially inflate their scores, instantly corrupting the dataset. By isolating the survey from pay scales and promotions, you establish a psychologically safe environment. That safety is what yields accurate, usable data about how an employee actually behaves. This is the Johari window. It is a psychological matrix used to categorize self-awareness and map the influx of new behavioral data we just collected. The open quadrant represents traits known to both the employee and their team. The hidden quadrant holds information the employee knows about themselves but keeps concealed from others. Both quadrants represent an existing baseline of self-awareness. The blind spot is our target zone. This quadrant contains behaviors, often limiting or destructive, that are entirely visible to the team but completely invisible to the employee evaluating themselves. Confronting this blind spot is highly disorienting. When an individual receives multi-directional feedback that contradicts their own self-image, the cognitive dissonance can be overwhelming. The 360-degree process systematically shrinks this blind spot. By flooding the individual with structured external observations, it forces them to acknowledge the gap between their intent and their actual impact. This mechanism works in a positive direction. Peer feedback shrinks the unknown potential quadrant, identifying latent leadership talents the subject didn't realize they possessed. Revealing these unknown traits is not an attack. It provides the necessary friction an employee needs to correct their flaws and maximize their hidden potential. Once the surveys close, the raw opinions must be compiled into a structured feedback report. The most critical function of this report is direct comparison. The subject fills out the exact same questionnaire as their team, allowing us to stack their self-evaluation scores directly against the aggregated averages of their peers. This radar chart maps those specific competency areas. A radar chart plots multiple variables on axes starting from the same center point. By overlaying the subject's self-score shape over the peer's score shape, we can visualize the structural gaps between self-perception and external reality. To drill down further, we use a histogram. A histogram is a bar graph that shows the frequency distribution of data points. This shows us whether the peer scores were a tightly unified consensus or a widely polarized scatter of opinions compared against the subject's single self-evaluation. Visualizing this variance strips the emotion out of the peer review. It translates subjective feelings into cold, objective data points the employee can actually analyze. Gathering and visualizing the data is only the preparation. The most precarious step is the in-person feedback interview, where the subject reviews their report. Without proper guidance, human nature takes over. Seeing hard data illustrating their blind spots, individuals naturally default to a defensive posture, rejecting the feedback entirely. This requires the presence of a trained feedback coach. The coach does not dictate solutions. Instead, they ask high-quality, probing questions, guiding the subject away from defensiveness toward objective reflection. When the data reveals a sharp statistical surprise, the coach reframes it. They help the employee view a low score in communication not as a personal failure, but as a specific, actionable area for skill development. Together, the coach and the subject work through the charts and the anonymous written comments, distilling dozens of data points down to 3 or 4 primary takeaways. Those takeaways dictate the final requirement, the Personal Development Plan, or PDP. This document outlines highly specific behavioral goals based on the peer feedback. These goals are actively tracked. The manager and employee use the PDP as a living checklist throughout the upcoming development cycle to ensure the required behavioral changes actually occur. Gathering anonymous data from every angle, visualizing the gaps in self-awareness, and executing a structured coaching plan, an organization converts raw opinions into a permanent engine for continuous human growth.